So it's my honor to introduce our next speaker, our keynote speaker, Hal Harvey. Hal is the CEO of Energy Innovation, a San Francisco-based energy and environmental policy firm. Energy Innovation delivers research and analysis to policymakers around the world across a range of jurisdictions to help inform their energy policy decisions. Hal's resume is pretty darn impressive. He was the founder and CEO of ClimateWorks Foundation. Thank you. He was the environmental program director at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and he was also the founder and president of the Energy Foundation. Unbelievable resume for Hal. He served on energy panels. He was appointed by President Bush, President Clinton. He's written lots of articles. He's written many books, including a new one that just came out in the last month or so called Designing Climate Solutions. In 2016, Hal was awarded the Heinz Award for the Environment, which Casey also won, I think, a few years earlier. So we've got two Heinz Award winners here. On a personal note, I've gotten the chance to get to know Hal over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And I get the chance, I mean, my job is very cool. I get to meet people all over the country who are doing this work. And I've met probably none that are as smart and thoughtful and as amazing as Hal Harvey. Hal, come on up, my friend.
Thank you, Greg. Well, it's not easy following Casey Golden anywhere in any circumstances. It's rather fantastic. If you think people from Seattle come down here with their nose in the air, you should see what people from California do when they come up to Portland. But we're compensating too. The very first thing I have to do, and this really is important, is to congratulate Climate Solutions, not on a great evening, but on an incredible, steadfast, brilliant, focused kind of leadership that it has exhibited year after year after year. And I've had a chance to stay close to this organization since it was founded, and with the principles even before it was founded. And you've got a jewel in your hands. And I'm not trying to raise money. I just want to make sure people understand what you've built here. So that's really important. It's also important to take note of the fact that in Oregon and Washington, as has been mentioned already by Meredith and others, you brought in a slate of electoral victories, not 100% of everything you wanted, but a really impressive election. And we have that in many other parts of the country as well. What I want to talk about today is how do we take advantage of that? What do we have to do to bend the curves, seriously? Greg mentioned we do have a new book out. It's called Designing Climate Solutions. We used all caps here. And I'll make sure that we get an email to everybody here if you would like a copy of this. You let us know. The reason we wrote this book is because it turns out that there are a small number of things you have to do to win on climate, and you have to do them rapidly, and you have to do them correctly. This is not the kind of problem where a bunch of little efforts win that are scattered all over the place. There has to be a kind of intensity, strategic intensity to win, and that's what I want to talk about this evening. It's an obligatory part of every climate talk to scare the crap out of the audience in the first part. And most climate talks of yore was 90% that and 10% vague hand-waving at solutions. I'm just going to offer 3 quick things about that maybe not everybody has fully grokked about why this is so urgent and why timing matters so much. If we are to land at a 2-degree future, we have to reduce global carbon emissions by 10% per year, year after year. That's where the 12 years comes from, by the way. If we had started in the year 2000, the rate of change could have been 3% per year. If we wait 10 more years, it has to be 30% per year. That's not going to happen. That's impossible. 10% per year is a hell of a reach, because remember, you're doing this in China, in Indonesia, and Australia, in India, as well as Oregon. So that's the first thing. It really is a now or never kind of a deal. There's no reverse gear here. There have been these big studies that have come out recently about the dangers of climate change. And here's the second point I need to make. climate modelers use 2 degrees centigrade change as the modeling convention that links all the models together. But the average doesn't matter. It's the extremes that matter. And if you look closely at the way the distribution of temperatures happens in a 2-degree world, the extremes go nuts. And it's the extremes that kill us. It's the extremes that in California and Oregon have dried out the soils and reduced precipitation and increased the heat and created a tinderbox. And if you look at the map, the campfires, you know, we just had 3 weeks, I'm still coughing, 3 weeks of smoke where I'm from. If you look at the map, there are 20 or 30 valleys just like that one with just as much fuel in them. The fire wasn't started by PG&E, the fire was started by conditions. The fire was inevitable. They're all inevitable. So it's these extreme conditions that are starting to hit us in the real world. Climate change was tapping us on the shoulder for a decade or two, and it's now giving us a shove. And it's a real one. Don't mistake it. By the way, I'm almost done depressing you. We're going to flip this around really quickly. But the extremes, there's some other extremes that are really worrying. There have been times already when half of the country of Bangladesh was underwater. 80 million people live there. So if you think the Syrian refugee crisis, which has rocked the political union of the European Union, was bad, wait till we see what climate change refugee flows. Think of the human cost, think of the political cost of that. Okay. Last horrible thing is that we unleash natural feedbacks. So the Arctic Ocean used to be white because it was covered with ice, and now it's blue and dark, and therefore it used to reflect sunshine, and now it absorbs it. The entire northern half of Siberia, Canada, and Alaska has massive amounts of frozen carbon and frozen methane in it. It's a great carbon store, and it's a great methane store unless it defrosts. And guess what's happening? The north is warming at twice the speed of the rest of the planet. So if that comes out, that's 1.5 degrees all by itself, never mind human things. So we're on the cusp of unleashing these systems for which there is no reverse gear. It spirals. Okay, I'm done with that. Here's the good news, and there's a lot of good news. We can make an enormous difference, and we can make it quickly. We have to make it quickly. This study that we did, and we've built an interactive computer model too, which anyone can use on the web to test this out yourself, is that there are 20 countries that really matter. 20 countries have 75% of all carbon emissions, or all greenhouse gas emissions. And there are 10 policies that make a huge difference. So if you get most of those policies in most of those countries, you can land at 2 degrees. That's not an impossible task. It's not an easy task, but it's not an impossible task by any means. Connected to that is the imperative to really, really understand who the decision maker is for each of these policies. And it's not always who you think it is. We live with the Jeffersonian ideal that a rising educational set of standards is going to make people better citizens, and then they're going to vote for better politicians, and those politicians are going to enact better laws. Not so much, right? Or maybe it's a great idea. It is a great idea, but it's not fast enough for what we need to do. We have to be more specific about who makes decisions and how we influence them. And I'm going to give you my favorite little bit of influencer math, which Climate Solutions knows very well. So half of the carbon in the US economy goes through monopoly pipes and wires, natural gas pipes and electrical wires. Because those are monopolies, they're regulated by public utilities commissions. The cash flow through these pipes and wires is well over $1 trillion a year. Those public utilities commissions get to decide whether that existing cash flow, you don't have to conjure up money, it's already there, whether the existing cash flow lands on brown choices or green choices. Flip the switch, and you get a lot of what's happened already in Oregon and California and Washington. Who makes that decision? It's not the US Senate, it's not the US President, it's 3 or 5 public utilities commissioners per state. So let's say it's 5 and there's 50 states. That's 250 individuals who control more than half the carbon in the US economy. But let's keep going with the math. 20 states are small. Forget them. And I'm not joking. Because this is a triage business. Speed and scale is my mantra. And so if you want scale, you have to go to the big states. So now you're down to 30 states that matter. That's 150 individuals. And you don't need a 5-0 vote. 3-2 is just fine. So we're now down to 90 people who get to decide most of the climate future of America. It's kind of cool, right? So then you have to stop and say, you have to do venue analysis. That's my other complete fixation. Who are these people? How'd they get their jobs? What's their statutory environment? What's their political environment? Are they political beings? How do they make decisions? Where do they go to church? What do their kids think of them? There's all kinds of questions you can ask like this. If you ask these questions, I'm kind of kidding about the church and the kids thing. Kind of, you got it. What you discover is they have set the table for us. Because public utilities commissioners are quasi-judicial forums. They have rules of order. They have dockets. They have calendars. They have rate reviews. They have integrated resource plans. Casey, thank you. And so you can present evidence and you can apply pressure and you can be logical and you can win the day. And the reason I know this is because Climate Solutions has done it again and again in the Northwest, and many other groups have done it in many other states. So that's the kind of thing we have to do. We have to identify who has the most ability to change. We have to know exactly what they have to do. We have to apply the pressure with precision so they get it done. And then we hang on and we keep going. Because how you do it matters as much as whether you do it. And there are many, many ways to design policy badly and very few ways to design it well. And I'm going to give some examples. And, you know, bad policy with good intentions is still bad policy. Yeah. Okay. The way I like to think about this, I'm an engineer and I'm a nerdly linear thinker, is start at the end and work backwards. So 80% of climate change gases come from energy systems. The grid, transportation, buildings, and industry. Whatever you do, you should test and see whether it affects one of those four systems. Did the treaty in Paris affect one of those four systems? Kind of, right? Because Obama came home and then they designed a clean power plan and then they implemented it and it all fell apart, but it didn't matter because the states are doing it anyway. The point is, Paris didn't save 1 kilogram of carbon. The implications of Paris may or may not, but they only will do so if they are expressed in policy state by state or nation by nation, right? You have to follow the red thread through to the physical thing in the economy that emits the carbon emissions, and then you have to fix that thing. Okay, here's some good news. I'm going to walk through these four sectors one by one, and I call this the 4 zeros. The zero carbon grid, zero emission vehicles, zero net energy buildings, and zero waste manufacturing. You don't actually have to get to zero, and the reason I say this is because there are lots of engineers and economists who say that last little bit's really expensive, and I say, fine, leave it for the kids, right? We'll do 80 or 90%. And by then we'll have invented so much more stuff, you know, but you can kind of shove that whole argument aside that you have to really be 100%. But zero makes better slogans than, you know. So I said technology is on our side. There is magic in learning curves. What are learning curves? The more you make of something, the cheaper they get. Transistors, automobiles, solar panels, 88% reduction in the price of solar in the last decade or so. Wind, cut in half. Offshore wind, this is magic on its way. Offshore wind has dropped in price 50% in the last 4 years alone. And offshore wind is amazing stuff because the wind really blows out there, and it blows all the time, and it's not correlated with onshore wind. And now they can float these damn turbines. They're so big, they cover 4 times the size of a football field. So since you can float them, you can put them on the Pacific coast where the seabed is deep, as well as the Atlantic coast where it's shallow. And you can put it so far offshore that nobody sees it. So the Kennedys don't get upset. Sorry. Cheap shot. And yes, batteries. Batteries are getting cheaper too. So as Greg and Casey pointed out, as soon as you start to raise the idea that we can solve this problem, because these technologies are now cheap, the objection hands go up. It's too hard. It's too complicated. We're going to make the grid unreliable. The sun goes down at night and the wind stops blowing. Well, those last two facts are true, but the others are not. The other thing is most people instinctively think, well, because renewable energy is a variable source, we need huge batteries to back them up, or fossil generation stations. Those are really expensive, and they are really expensive. Battery costs have plummeted, but there is nothing yet approaching bulk power storage that lasts for weeks at a time for batteries. Maybe there will be. I don't know if you're clapping because there isn't, or because there will be, or because I'm right. Anyway, just as long as you're clapping, I'm happy. So so I'm going to walk through a hierarchy of ways to solve this problem that does not require miracles. The first thing we have to do is use existing copper better. What do I mean by that? There are copper wires linking San Diego and Seattle today. San Diego and Seattle never have the same peak power demand, and they never have the same mix of supplies. And if you hook them together, they smooth each other miraculously. So why don't we do it? It's because we've got too much pride locked up in things like balancing zones in the grid. We don't optimally use the existing grid, which is crazy economically and crazy ecologically. You want a great battery? You want the hugest battery in North America? You want it free? You want it tomorrow? It's called the Bonneville Power Administration, right? Water behind the dam is exactly functionally equal to electricity in a battery. But if you use it for bulk power, you're just wasting it. Use it to balance renewables. Why not, right? It's there. Don't sell it to yourself for 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Sell it to us down in California for 20 cents a kilowatt hour and keep the 18 cents. Go for it. Be my guest. So use the existing grid and the existing systems better. That is not free. That's the lunch you're paid to eat. The East Coast of the United States has integrated its power grids, and they are saving $3 billion a year. And we have not out here in the West, and that's kind of silly. Next, demand response. Another boring topic, right? You guys are weird. So what does this mean? If it's going to be a hot, windless day in Houston, Texas, or Los Angeles, or Las Vegas, and these are things you know 24 hours in advance, whether the wind's going to blow or not and how hot it's going to be, pre-cool the damn buildings just a little bit, right? Pre-cool them 3 or 4 degrees between 3 in the morning and 6 in the morning. You're not going to hurt the power system then, but that means in the afternoon when it's baking hot, you're cycling your air conditioner half as often because the building is a thermal battery. We have 100 million large-scale batteries in America already. They're called buildings. We just don't use them that way. Every hot water heater, all you care about is when you turn on the tap, there's hot water. You don't care when or how it gets hot as long as it's available. So with something as tiny as a switch and a radio, which is what costs $5, $3 nowadays, you can turn every hot water heater into a significant thermal storage unit. And it's happening. There's more than 1 gigawatt of hot water heaters chained together in Minnesota. And you don't even notice it. There's 1 million of those Nest thermostats that offer demand response already. The extra cost of doing that, 0. Literally. Okay, demand response is a big deal. How big? In California, they found 6 gigawatts of demand response cheaper than any supply option. 6 gigawatts, that's like 6 huge power plants for free. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Fast cycling natural gas. This is when the pitchforks come out, right? We have a lot of natural gas in America. It should not be used for bulk power. It should be used as a premium fuel for the few hours in North Dakota in the winter when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing and you want to stay warm and you want to stay alive. If you run a natural gas turbine for a couple hundred hours a year, the fossil footprint is negligible. If you run it for 4,000 hours a year, the fossil footprint's big. So it's there. The fuel is cheap. Balance the system with it. What the hell? Again, the carbon numbers are tiny. The social benefit, the electricity benefit, the economic benefit is huge. And then, last of all, storage. I'm an advocate of batteries, but my point with putting this whole list of issues together is we don't need them. So that's the technology for a zero-carbon grid. It's fast upon us. It's also extremely important because the simplistic motto is zero-carbon electricity and then electrify everything. Right? And there's a lot to that slogan. Not everything a lot, but quite a bit. So how do you get there? Well, renewable portfolio standards are terrific, and the Pacific Northwest is fast on its way to a zero-carbon grid. It helps because you've got so much hydro. It helps because you've passed great laws. The learning curves that I talked about did not just happen by mistake. They took political courage, and they took some economics. They took some money to drive those technologies down the price curve. Oregon helped the world. This is a theme I'm going to come back to, by helping drive solar and especially wind down the price curve. So did California, so did Germany, so did Italy, so did Spain. And by the way, so did China, right? It's now cheaper to build a wind farm from scratch, paying all capital costs, than to simply pay the operating costs of a coal-fired power plant in Colorado. That's a crossover point. And by the way, commodity prices do this. Commodity prices go up and down. Technology prices, one-way deal. So when you cross, you cross. It's pretty great. Okay. We need to continue with renewable portfolio standards in more parts of the world. We also need to use the utilities as engines for energy efficiency, with which the Pacific Northwest has fantastic experience, but not to scale. And we need to build flexibility into the system as the way I just defined. That zero carbon grid is right in front of us. We better grab it. I'm going to turn now to transportation. So I said, make the grid decarbonized and then electrify everything. Almost 30 years ago, 28 years ago, I took a Ford Escort, which is the stupidest, ugliest, dumbest car they made that year. It was a used one. And I disemboweled it. So I took out the engine and the radiator and the transmission and the springs and the brakes and the suspension system and the steering and the heater. And then I rebuilt it as an electric car. And I used 18 big golf course cart batteries. And I had to do the suspension system because it was so heavy, those old springs wouldn't do the deal. And I had to change for manual steering because I didn't have a pump for electrical steering. On and on and on. The car worked great. It would only go 65 miles an hour. But that was okay. I used it for 5 years, and I put up solar panels. I got them from the Park Service. They were sitting in a storeroom, which is a really stupid place to keep a solar panel. And so I had zero carbon transportation almost 30 years ago. And I did this in my garage, and it wasn't that hard. And it wasn't that good of a car either, but it was okay. I now have a BMW i3, which is a great car. The BMW i3 is aluminum from here down and carbon fiber from there up. It's very light. It weighs just over half as much as the average car. But it's just as safe because it's so strong. So the point of this is technology can do a lot for us. Now, I'm pro-bicycle and don't use my car that often, because that's important too. But we're a car-dependent society, and we have to drive transportation emissions to zero. Transportation emissions are now the largest source in America of carbon dioxide. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? Okay. Keep going. So here's what you can do with cars. You can put in better engines. There's some fantastic new engines designed. You can change the driveline. You can make them more aerodynamic. You ever look at the bottom of an airplane? Smooth. Bottom of a car? Not so much. It's mess down there, right? But you're pushing that crap through the air every time you drive. That's not smart. Auxiliary loads, air conditioning. There are new paints that cool the car by 10 degrees. Imagine your car sitting in a parking lot in Las Vegas, and it's 10 degrees cooler, and you didn't touch it. There's heat-resistant glass. There are low rolling resistance tires. The point is the menu is great, and the most important thing on the menu is lightweighting, right? The average car in America weighs almost 4,000 pounds, and about 10% of the energy you put into the car moves the car. The thermodynamics of automobiles is a shame. It really is. And then why do you need $4,000 for a 150-pound person or a 180-pound person? It's kind of a ridiculous ratio. And then you're not really carrying the person around half the time, you're carrying a pizza, right? So you're moving 4,000 pounds of steel at 10% efficiency to move a piece of pizza to your house. So we got to do better than that. And we can. We need to accelerate electrification. It's fantastic that Oregon has adopted the California ZEV standard. There's a quirk in the American Clean Air Act that lets the feds choose a set of regs, and California can choose stronger ones, and then any state can choose one or the other. So I know you're saying, thank you, California, right? Hosannas, right? So there are 13 states. Is it okay if I go over by about 5 minutes? Okay. I will accelerate. I see that hook coming out, you know. There are carrots and sticks to cause the zero-emission vehicle revolution to happen. And the stick is the zero-emission vehicle mandate, which requires manufacturers to sell a certain fraction of them. The carrots are things like access to HOV lanes or tax credits or preferential parking and so forth. We are selling 1% of the fleet as electric vehicles today. That's not the tipping point, right? We have to push this one hard, and it's going to happen in the enlightened states. It's not going to happen first in Alabama. It's just not. right? But there's this virtuous cycle. 2/3 of all renewables have been put into red states. They didn't start the revolution, but they're happy to take advantage of it. And that's fine with me too. We have to do the same with electric vehicles. I'm going to shoot ahead a little bit and talk quickly about industry and then finally buildings and a wrap up. Industry is complicated because it's heterogeneous, and people kind of throw their hands up. And environmental groups are not good at thinking about industrial energy consumption or industrial decarbonization. And it's a big deal. 70% of carbon emissions in China come from the industrial sector. And China has more than twice the carbon emissions of the United States. So China's industrial sector alone is bigger than the whole United States. So what do you do with that? The first thing is there are some technologies that are ubiquitous, like motors and pumps. So you set very high performance standards for them, and then you issue design guidelines for how they're used, and you can save vast amounts of energy. It's dull, but it's effective. Then there's some exciting stuff, and this is a place where I think Portland could play a really interesting and important role, which is substituting for materials with design. What do I mean by that? If you imagine a concrete bridge, it's a rectangular slab of concrete with some steel inside. If you unpack that and look at the stresses within that bridge, it turns out that you don't need about 2/3 of the material. Most of that material is inert. It's not doing anything for you. If you could put cement only where the stresses were, only where the forces were transmitted, you could save about 2/3 of the cement. Well, how do you do that? 3D printing. They 3D print cement things now. When you 3D print something, complexity is free. So I've seen 3D printed houses in China. You don't have to build something out of cement and then smash it apart to put in your wires and your copper pipes and your doors and everything else. Just put the material exactly where you want it. You can do this with steel and with aluminum and with concrete. There's a revolution that has to grow in rethinking the way we use materials in society. It has to do with recyclability, with decarbonized cement. In every one of these things, I won't go through it all, but I will tell you there are specific strategies that can really accelerate this. The industrial sector is really 10 sectors. It's cement and concrete and non-ferrous metals and steel, cement and concrete, same thing. Pulp and paper, chemicals, fertilizers. It's not every industry, it's a small number that are totally dominant. Each of those needs a vector of innovation, and they need policies behind them to do that. And there's some great policies to do that. So, let me turn quickly to buildings and then try to wrap this all up. The Anasazi knew about overhangs and thermal mass in buildings. So did the Greeks. They knew how to orient their living spaces to capture sun when they needed it, and how to orient overhangs so that they didn't overheat when they didn't need it. And we forgot all that when we came up with cheap, abundant fossil fuels. The United Nations building is the worst in the world. It's this vast expanse of glass facing due west and just cooking all day long, everybody in there. It's just insane. But that's okay, because we put an enormous air conditioner on the top. Well, now you do things differently. There's spectrally selective glass. It lets you tune up for exactly the climate and even the direction of your glass. So it's a heater if you need it in North Dakota, and it's a cooler all by itself in Houston, Texas. So if you do a handful of things, which is basically good insulation, good fenestration, a modicum of thermal mass, think about your orientation and get your overhangs right. None of this is rocket science. There's some rocket science parts you can do too if you want. Then you drive energy costs down by about 80%. The only policy that successfully, at scale and speed, especially scale, creates great buildings is a great building code. And one of the elements of a... I love this audience. This is the first time in history that more than 6 people have applauded the words building code. So what's a great building code? Jerry Brown was the youngest governor in California's history. He passed a building code called Title 24, and it's got this little trick. Every 3 years it gets tighter, and they don't have to go back to the ledge. They just have to prove it's cost-effective to get tighter. And so these technocrats, engineers, Mike Cousins, right, they do the work and they tighten it up. And this happens through Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. Jerry Brown's now the oldest governor in California's history. Jerry Brown. And he used his political bandwidth once to deliver the goods year after year after year. This is continuous improvement, and you should build into every policy you get passed. Don't set a renewable portfolio standard at 40%. Set it at 3% a year growth. Don't set a fuel efficiency standard at 40 miles per gallon. Set it at 4% a year growth. Use your political capital once, get your benefits forever. Simple idea, really powerful. All right. The Clean Energy Jobs Bill or Act, which we've talked about quite a bit, is before the Oregon legislature. So I want to take a minute to talk about cap and trade. This is better than the State of the Union address. I need to introduce the astronauts now and the firefighters. Anyway, everything I've talked about so far is sector-specific strategies, especially performance standards, which, by the way, have been the big winner in abating climate change, in transforming technologies and driving technologies down the learning curve. The wrapper is pricing carbon, and it can be done with a carbon cap or a carbon tax. And by the way, don't get religious about one or the other. Take whatever you can get, right? Because they're the same. They're the same. Within most reasonable parameters, they deliver the same result. There are a number of ways of designing a cap. I prefer caps because it's not as obvious what you're doing. But you can put a floor on the price and a floor on the ceiling of a cap, so you can eliminate the possibility that it's meaningless, which the European cap was for a decade, because the price was so low, and RGGI was also essentially meaningless. You can also eliminate the possibility that it crushes your economy by putting a cap on it. So there's a few design parameters for every one of these policies that makes them much more effective. That's, again, what this book is all about, is how do you choose, and once you've chosen, how do you implement? How do you design the policies? The California carbon cap was projected by certain people who will go and mention to ruin the California economy. So since we imposed the cap, we've gone from the 11th largest economy in the world to the 5th, right? So that didn't happen. Now, we can't credit all the prosperity on our carbon cap. Well, I don't know, why not? The point is simple. You create a long-term signal. You make it steadily tighter. You make it crystal clear who's going to be regulated. And they react. And it turns out to be pretty cheap to decarbonize many, many sectors of the economy. The price has been much lower than projected. The economic impacts have been negligible. And it's going to spitting off about $3 billion per year that the governor and the Air Resources Board, half of which goes into underserved communities, and all of which goes into decarbonization. Pretty cool. So sign up to that thing. Let's spread this to a few more places. I'm going to wind up now with just a couple of points. The first one is we have this opportunity in front of us to get to these 4 zeros. We need the smartest, most focused, most intense policy in each case. And that requires a certain precision in design and a certain precision in political activism. And we cannot let it go. The time to celebrate the election was for the first 15 minutes or 30 minutes. And now we got to take advantage of it. That's, of course, what Climate Solutions is all about. And that's, of course, what everybody in here is about. This is a moment of opportunity. This is not a narrative of sacrifice, and don't let anybody fool you. This is a narrative of when you do the right things, the rewards come back. They come back in community, they come back in clean air, and they come back in stronger and healthier businesses. I sometimes say strong standards make strong companies. And if you don't believe that, go spend a little time unpacking why the auto companies in America failed. Right? The Germans and the Japanese did not slow down in their energy efficiency and their engineering, and we innovated in cup holders for 2 decades. So that's not good enough. That's not good enough. Last thing I'm going to say, so we need to pass in the Pacific Northwest these focus policies. We need to use our political force to get them done. When you do that, you start a snowball that brings along the other states with it, because you make it cheap and obvious to do the right thing. And when people can do the right thing without having a political argument about climate change and just do it anyway, that's okay. That's fine. And that's happening. It's happening. But we're sort of moving in the 0 to 20, 0 to 40% range. We need to quickly move into the 40 to 80% range in every one of these vectors. I want to finish, again, by really admiring the people in this room and the Climate Solutions team. I've watched you since you were born as an organization. And I love the work you guys do. It is precisely what's needed. Intensify. Do it more. Do it harder. We can win this one. Thank you.